Hi there. And so the fourth episode of Stalin and the Terror. And this episode is going to look at the effects of the terror, good and bad, and look at them from different perspectives. So that if you should be facing an essay on this, you will have different perspectives that you can give. I think you'll find it useful. Certainly hope so.
Whatever the debates about the why or differences of opinion about where to place the emphasis on the how, there's no disputing that the effects of the purges and the terror were far-reaching. And the most important historical effect was that Stalin kept control. Stalin was successful in eliminating all opposition. His control of party and country was unchallenged until his death. His biggest crisis would come in June 1941, when Hitler's Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Stalin had blundered, and he was shocked, he was rattled. But whether he suffered a breakdown or not, Alan Bull in Hitler and Stalin Parallel Lives suggests he did. Richard Overy in The Dictators, which also looks at Hitler as well as Stalin, suggests not. Whether he suffered that breakdown or not, he did recover. And actually, Stalin had a good war. But such was the fear of those close to him that when Stalin had his stroke in March 1953, he lay on the floor of his room, paralysed for hours, before guards ventured to check why he had not come out of his room. So maybe Stalin paid his dues. But the revolution was secured, and I've given a number of key outcomes from that. Socialism in one country was the policy. Collectivization was forced through. The planned economy, the command economy was put in place, and preparations were made for war. But there was also chaos. The execution of government officials and managers in industry caused chaos in planning and in industrial production. And positive criticism that would have fixed some fundamental problems was completely stifled. So the revolution was secured, but it was weakened. Now some numbers, and these are numbers about people, and it serves to remind us that history is always about people. Almost 4 million people were arrested, convicted and sentenced by NKVD agencies. But they were not the only ones involved in arresting, convicting and sentencing people. In 1940 alone, there were 4 million people in one kind of penal institution or another. And in 1950, almost 6.5 million people. Approximately 775,000 people were executed. More than 750,000 people. The total deaths in camps, and this is the total above those that were executed, the people who had died of disease, of malnutrition, frostbite, or people who were simply overworked This amounted to a little over 1 million people. 1 million people. The Great Terror and its peak years of 1937-8 account for about 35% of all convictions and 88% of all executions. But even in the normal years, the average number of executions was a little over 1,400 people. And we have to bear in mind that these figures, today we are reasonably confident that they are close to the true figures, but they are likely to be underestimating the actual total. Now, I've already mentioned that the revolution was weakened, and this is my focus now. The purges created gaps in the administration of party and state, and these gaps needed filling. This was done by a body of people who came to be known as the nomenklatura, the privileged elite of party officials who owed everything to Stalin. For Stalin, this creation of a new Soviet intelligentsia and the nomenklatura was in part that intelligentsia, in part the party's administrative class. It meant his power base was secure. It meant the party's power base was secure. For this group owed everything to the revolution and to the party and to Stalin. As for the new elite themselves, they were proud of their working class roots, but boy, were they glad they had left that past behind. They liked their perks, their privileges, and who could blame them? They were considerable. Incomes that under Lenin had been set, at least in theory, at the average wage of skilled workers, well, the privileged elite were now enjoying much higher salaries. They could shop in privileged stores with goods not available anywhere else. They also had access to a range of services and goods. Living in special apartment blocks with chauffeur-driven cars, holidays at special resorts and comfortable dacas, their weekend homes. This was no longer an egalitarian revolution. It was kept inconspicuous as far as possible, but old Bolsheviks, as well as others, were uneasy about the whole thing. But it still persisted. And the price paid by peasants and workers was high. Their lack of freedom, their standard of living, their quality of life, their alienation from the whole project, the living and working conditions of the workers and their families, the millions that died as a result of the famine that peaked in 1932-33, itself a result of forced collectivization. The fact that a consumer economy had been all but ignored. It was claimed that these things would improve, but they didn't. And what of the socialist state? Local Soviets acted more like local fiefdoms, not Soviet democracy. Peasants and workers were being exploited more than they had ever been. And as for the withering away of the state was growing day by day. This growth of the state may be seen as a necessary part of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but surely not the exploitation. And Russians were immersed in a reign of fear. That by the end of 1939, most ordinary Russians were in a state of terror, reluctant to talk openly. And what is more, I think the wider political and social implications can still be seen in Russia to this day. Is Putin's Russia that different to Stalin's politically and socially? And that the purge of the armed forces very much weakened them, again, cannot be disputed. A former Soviet general would later comment how the young officer corps were the flower of the nation, with Civil War experience, and most of them relatively young, and that the blow to the armed forces was immense. And indeed, the army struggled. It performed badly in the Russo-Finnish War of 1939-40 and was unable to hold the Germans when they invaded in 1941. Stalin himself realised that it had gone too far. Beria replaced Yezhov as the General Commissar of State Security and People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. And Yezhov, like Yagoda before him, would be executed. Apparently, he had been a British agent all along. And a new period known as the Spring of Liberalism led to the release of several thousand Gulag prisoners, the rehabilitation of many of those who had been expelled from the party or who had lost their jobs, including many of the Red Army victims. Though it should also be noted that arrests, imprisonment and executions continued, if on a much reduced scale. But the terror had served its purpose, and Stalin had got what he wanted. By the end of the terror, he had a coward party, a coward state, and a coward people, and so was able to tone things down.